Hello and welcome back to Away with the Pharaohs. This week we will be answering the question, were Egyptian temples built to honour the heavens or elevate earthly rulers? And I'm very excited to have with us Dr. Kelly Accetta Crowe, who is, of course, a project curator at the British Museum. You curated the hieroglyphs exhibition back in 2022-23 and have been working on some touring exhibitions, including one on Egyptian magic. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's quite an exciting undertaking, to be fair, to do touring exhibitions after doing a Bloomsbury exhibition. So yeah, very different, but very exciting.
Great. And of course, you studied your undergrad archaeology and art history degree at the University of Virginia.
Yep.
In the US.
Indeed.
And then you moved over here to the UK to study your MPhil in Egyptology and your PhD in archaeology at the University of Cambridge.
Yeah, got a bit addicted to it, so stuck around.
Yes. And of course, you've been on many excavations in Egypt, but I suppose one of the most recent is the New Kingdom Research Foundation's project looking at the tomb of Thutmose II. And of course, we had an article about that in EA 63, and there might be some updates soon.
Yes, well, we're hoping, but it's been a busy season. It started in September because, of course, Ramadan's so early this year. So they've been out there in 50-degree weather. Don't envy that. But I'll be joining them in a couple of weeks, which I'm very excited about.
Oh, very exciting. Possibly when this podcast is out and available.
It might be, yeah.
And of course, I have to note that you've been tutor on various very popular EES courses. You did one on temples.
I did, yeah.
Which this is a follow-on from, of course.
It is. We would be cramming far less information into this, I will say, than I tried to do in that one.
Yes, this will just be skimming the surface. But yeah, of course, please do check out our EES website for EES courses and other events where you can learn more beyond these podcast episodes. But coming back to temples, the theme of today. So your dissertation was focused on thresholds and doorways and movements in New Kingdom Theban temples.
Yes.
So of course you spent a lot of time in Luxor looking at the temples. So from your experience there and chatting with the teams that are working there, can you tell us a bit more about obviously the modern aspects to those temples, but also what a temple is in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so obviously doorways are a very specific part of anything, but it's very addicting to get into these types of things. You start noticing the tiny details. But yes, I spent lots of time in Luxor. I spent wonderful amounts of time with the Polish and French teams at Deir el-Bahri and at Karnak. They were so helpful. And of course, the American team at Medinet Habu. And they all really helped me break down and see what I was looking at, which of course is a challenge because as we know, Egyptian temples today are often a ruinous state. So they're not looking like they would have looked in ancient times and full of tourists, which is also very, very different. And actually, that's the number one difference, I think, between understanding what an ancient temple was to the ancient Egyptians and how we look at it today, because we hear the word temple and we think of our modern houses of worship, mosques, churches, synagogues. These are all places where people come to gather together in the house of God to worship as a congregation. It's very different in ancient Egypt. So you're still looking at a temple as a house of a god, but it's his personal residence, if you like. So you're only there by invitation. We're not getting the public coming in. There are people who are specifically serving the god. There's, of course, the king who has access as this divine intermediary between humans and gods. But you're not having your normal everyday people coming in and out of a temple. So when you go to Luxor today and you're in Karnak with hundreds, if not thousands of tourists, so very different than what it would have been like in ancient times, of course. And another thing is, of course, we get a lot of light in temples nowadays because a lot of times they're missing their roofs, biggest thing that is missing. And that's not how it would have been. We would have had kind of progressively darker and more intimate spaces coming into temples. So it's really fascinating once you start thinking about that. And, like I said, big thanks to those teams that were excavating these temples for really helping me envision this when I was there, which is just hugely transformative, really, because it's a very different experience than you have today. But yeah, to bring it back, kind of the Egyptian temple obviously evolves over the millennia that Egypt existed. It starts off perhaps as quite a local idea. So there's a local god serving a local purpose, perhaps. In Elephantine, we obviously have the gods that are concerned with the Nile flooding coming from the first cataracts there. And maybe these people were worshiping those gods for a specific reason, leaving votive offerings, little presents, sculptures, etc. to hopefully persuade the gods to benefit them. And we might have seen a bit more access for a normal person into the temples at this time. But then over time, as the theme of this podcast is, we start to see state intervention. The king really gets more involved with how temples are built and how they should be run. And we're starting to see more standardization that comes along into the temples that maybe we know a bit more today from images of Egypt. And we're seeing grand statues and elaborate hieroglyphs carved into the walls and similar things across the entire country that were much different from how we get in the early periods when those temples, we sometimes call them pre-formal temples. That was something coined by the archaeologist Barry Kemp. And these pre-formal temples are very unique to the locations versus later on we start to see a very typical kind of Egyptian temple, what we would easily recognize.
I really enjoy some of the imagery with the earlier temples that reflect the local environment as well. You see a lot of plant depictions in those as well, don't you?
And also a lot of kind of natural architecture. So I mentioned the temple at Elephantine. We've got two there for the Khnum and Satet, the two gods that are worshipped as a dyad. They are triad with their child in the area. And actually, one of the temples, the original architecture is between these massive natural boulders that form a kind of tiny sanctuary space. And that sticks around for a while. So the boulders are hugely important, and we start to see kind of mud brick architecture being built around it. But then later on, when the temple becomes formalized, even though we no longer can physically see the boulders because they're under the floor, they're still in alignment with the sanctuary. So it's still understood that the importance of that original kind of more natural sanctuary is drawn upon for the more formal temple. So it's the really unique bits are fascinating in the early periods.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And I think that leads us perfectly to talk more about the physicality of temples and their architecture. And of course, you mentioned modern houses of worship. So, for example, mosques are often built to face Mecca, of course. And you've just mentioned the alignment with those natural features.
Yeah.
Is that seen more throughout Egyptian history? And how does that link to their religious belief system?
Yeah, absolutely. And fascinatingly, we can actually follow some changes in the religious kind of beliefs by looking at the architecture of temples. So when we start off, as I mentioned, we're seeing kind of very unique things basically embedded into the landscape. So people are paying attention to what's important in their immediate vicinity. And then as we get to the end of the Old Kingdom, we start to see a bit more of this royal prerogative coming in to standardize. But during the Old Kingdom, we're still seeing a very kind of stellar alignment, if you like, to temples. So they're aligned north-south, essentially. So the main axis, if you're walking straight through down towards the sanctuary, is going to run on a north-south axis. And this is because we see in a lot of in kind of the only early religious texts, the pyramid texts, we start to see a lot of the metaphors of the king joining the gods in the heaven after his death, the circumpolar stars, these stars that never set around the North Star. And there's that real emphasis that that's where the gods live, and therefore the king specifically, but presumably we can maybe assume others who pass on as well want to join the gods there. Now, unfortunately, because of literacy rates, we really only know about the king, especially at these early periods. But this seems to make a lot of sense to us because we start getting temples that are not just built for the gods themselves, but we're starting to get temples that are attached to where the kings are buried. So, of course, the pyramids, very famous. They have temples attached to them on their north sides. In the early periods on their north sides, we'll get to the big grand temples at Giza later. And that's to kind of exploit this stellar alignment. So the Step Pyramid, for instance, at Saqqara. This is a really great example of the funerary temple is on the north side of the pyramid. Not decorated, interestingly. We don't really get a lot of relief decoration in this. So it's the architecture itself and perhaps movable objects such as large statues that are now no longer there, which might be important. But it's really that alignment of the stars that we're looking at. And then this starts to shift a bit, interestingly, and we start to see an emphasis on the narrative of the solar creation of the universe and the sun and the king who adopts the title Son of Ra, so the sun god himself. And that's when we start to see a physical shift. Again, with the pyramids, especially the ones at Giza, the temples are now on the east side. So following the alignment of the sun, this east-west setting. And we see that perfectly displayed with not only the temples that abut the pyramids directly, so the funerary temple, but also the valley temple, which kind of meets the Nile when it was flooded, coming up to the pyramids themselves. And this is this shift with the kind of funerary beliefs revolving with the cycle of the sun. So the sun sets each evening in the west. This is kind of the death, if you like, but then is reborn in the east each day. And that's what the Egyptians themselves want. They want this eternal life in the afterlife. Therefore, they see it in the sun's rebirth cycle of the sun, and the temple's there to facilitate that. And in the fourth dynasty, we start to get a bit more decoration as well. So we're starting to branch out in what the style is for the temple, although the physical building is quite similar to earlier periods.
Yeah. And this is quite interesting because this is 4,500 years ago. And that change from the north side of Saqqara to the east side at Giza is only a few hundred years apart, really, isn't it?
It is. But then we get another sudden shift. So like I was mentioning, the physical shape of the temple with this middle axis that's kind of directly from the entrance all the way through the sanctuary, broken up by doors, obviously, so you couldn't see straight through. That doesn't really change, but we start to see kind of other values changing. So we get sun temples, for instance, in the later Old Kingdom. And these are built around possibly tall obelisk-like structures. They seem to be more heavily dedicated to the god than the king himself, unlike the kind of funerary temples we had. But that also changes. So this is a very quick thing that happens, post the pyramids at Giza, but before the end of the Old Kingdom. But then very suddenly, we no longer see those sun temples either. And when we're trying to ask ourselves, what is causing this rapid change? We're starting stellar alignment, solar alignment. We don't lose the solar alignment, but something else comes in. And that's the rise of Osiris as god of the dead. And so we're not seeing the kind of dominance of just the solar narrative anymore. Suddenly we have this kind of funerary narrative that's more grounded, if you like, in Osiris. So funerary temples slightly want to change in that respect. But of course, that idea of rebirth as the sun is very important. So after this, we don't see really a change anymore from the east-west axis. That stays. In almost every temple, we have the east-west alignment. Now, of course, if it's a funerary temple, it being on the western side of the Nile, its entrance faces east, the sanctuaries on the west, versus the temples to the gods tend to be on the eastern bank of the Nile. So we have the entrance on the west and the sanctuary in the east where the sun would rise. So you still have a bit of metaphor going on there, but they both share that east-west alignment, which is really interesting. Of course, there's an exception to this, and that's where you have temples which are dominant over other temples. So this is quite funny. So Karnak, a lot of people are familiar with this, largest ancient religious complex in the world, east-west alignment. It's a solar temple, obviously, the god Amun-Ra, sun god, god of creation. But there's a secondary temple, Luxor Temple, also very famous. But Luxor is secondary to Karnak, and therefore it follows a north-south alignment because it is kind of submissive, if you like, to Karnak's east-west alignment. And that's because they're tied together in that way. It's quite fascinating, but it's kind of the only one that breaks that east-west, even though it's still a temple dedicated to a sun god.
Yeah, that's so interesting because you assume all these would follow the same axis, but yeah, that interplay, because they are very close as well.
Yeah. And I think this comes back to the idea that the Egyptians are, they're looking at things with ritual, but also practical eye. If there's an interaction between two buildings, if there's an interaction between two spaces, how do you make it clear that that interaction is happening?
I want to go back to the idea of Osiris, so god of the afterlife. It's quite interesting. I'm going to bring up the example of Abu Simbel, which was recently voted as a top wonder of Egypt by our members. Check out our website if you're a member, our Experience Egypt Zone, to find out more. But that's a really interesting, we noted the very early temples have these unique elements to them, but Abu Simbel has this great feature about enlightening or not some of the depictions of the gods in the shrine.
Yes.
And in the main temple, there's obviously depictions of Ramesses II, but as Osiris.
Yes.
So there's that interesting duality there between the god and the king.
Absolutely. And I think this is a big and tricky question because we can't go and ask an ancient Egyptian exactly how they perceived this. Oh,
that would be
so
nice.
Many people wish we could. But this idea of divinity of the king and just how entangled he is with the gods. So we know he calls himself the son of Ra. And in many other things, he's, being shown being nursed by Isis or various other goddesses, being kind of imbued with their powers. But is he actually God? And from what we can tell from the writings, from the mythologies, from kind of religious texts, that in the earlier period, probably up into the reign of Ramses II, well, actually maybe a bit earlier, Akhenaten, kind of depending on which god you're looking at, the king is viewing himself as the embodiment of a god. So he is Horus on earth, if you like. So Horus being the son of Osiris being the original king on earth before he's brutally murdered by his own brother, and passes away to become king of the underworld. So all the Egyptian kings, when they die, become Osiris. So they are definitely divine post-death. They are Osiris in the underworld. But on earth, probably up until about late 18th, early 19th dynasty, we are looking at a human who is just an embodiment of the divine. Now, he is very uniquely placed because he's between the gods. He can speak to them, he's nursed by them, he's protected by them, but he's also representing the people. And of course, his main goal is to maintain Ma'at, balance, justice, order on earth, which is a task basically set by the divine for the king to do this. So it's very important to show him doing that in temples, because one of the best ways to maintain Ma'at is to make sure the gods are satisfied, the gods are placated, they're not wreaking havoc on earth, they're bestowing their blessings on Egypt itself. So yes, in temples like Abu Simbel, we see the king portraying himself as a god, interacting with the gods, but most importantly, offering to the gods. And this brings us to the king's kind of most important role when it comes to a temple, which is as the high priest. So if you notice on all the walls, we know there's lots of rituals happening on temples. And the king obviously can't be in every temple in Egypt every day for every ritual. That would be quite impressive. So he's obviously represented in reality by a phalanx of priests, including high priests, to do all these things. But in the actual imagery on the walls of temples, it's always the king making the offerings. It's always the king worshiping the gods, the king reciting praise or hymns, etc. And that's very important to show not only his political power, of course, his wealth, his ability to commission all of these things, but also to emphasize his unique role as this intermediary. And tying in magic, because I have to now, is my other obsession. The great thing about depictions on walls or hieroglyphs themselves is they're considered kind of divine words, divine images. So whatever they're showing is going to happen for eternity because it's been carved. Even better if it's carved in stone, obviously, because this is a more permanent material.
And this is really interesting. For those of you who've dabbled in learning hieroglyphs, there's a very popular offering formula that you may have read, which starts with an offering which the king gives to a god, often Osiris.
Often Osiris.
So yeah, it's even that which most, well, I would say common people, but most likely elite people who are creating stela where these are preserved for us to see today, they are perpetuating this idea that the king is that intermediary.
Exactly. Yeah, I had to explain this not long ago because another museum we're working with, and obviously they don't have Egyptologists on staff, and they were looking at one of these exact phrases on a stela, an offering which the king gives, and they were describing it literally. Oh, the king has given this offering to this god on behalf of this man. And I was like, it's not describing an actual event. It's complete stock phrase. This guy may never have met the king entirely. But yeah, you're right. It's this perpetuated idea that even though it's the individual who's giving the offering to the god, to legitimize it through the king gives that more power. So yes, hugely important. And we obviously see that in temples everywhere. Abu Simbel is a great example. And I mean, we even have that beautiful statue at the very end. If we tie this all back to the solar cycle again, keep coming back to the east-west thing. So Abu Simbel is a temple dedicated to Amun. Obviously, a lot of people think it's dedicated to Ramses himself, but it is not. It's glorifying Ramses through Amun, if you like. And at the back, we see 4 individuals sat at the back, Ramses, Amun, and 2 other gods. And because of the alignment of the temple, twice a year, every year I think it happens now on the 22nd of February and October, but it would have been one day earlier, that the sun would shine directly all the way down from the entrance of the temple. If you opened all the doors in between the sanctuary and the entrance, all the way through to light on that statue at the back. And that's quite an amazing power, metaphor, magical moment now today for observers. But in the past, it wouldn't have been seen necessarily by groups of people. The point was that it happened. So the sun was literally lending its power back into the gods and, of course, the king himself.
Yes.
For eternity.
Very interesting. And yeah, I believe it only lit up 3 of them and left Ptah in darkness.
Even better. I mean, which is great because Ta, of course, becomes subsumed, Ta Soker Osiris, as a funerary god himself. So even though he's a creator god, he wears lots of hats, Ta. But that's even better. Yeah. Love that.
Yeah, and I think it's one day later now because they had to move the entire temple because of the Nile flood.
Right. Yes, this is true. That was a fascinating project. My goodness, if you ever have a chance, we're not going to talk about that today because it's a modern marvel of engineering, but what an undertaking. Yeah, so when the high dam went in, the temple would have been flooded and it was saved jointly with Egypt and UNESCO, and absolutely wonderful.
Like what you're hearing and want to take it to the next level? Then check out our online events, courses and resources available at www.ees.ac.uk.
So we've obviously been touching upon the king's role in temples, and this season has been talking mostly about royal figures, away with the pharaohs. We couldn't avoid it. So yeah, you also mentioned, of course, temples become more standardized because of state involvement. So can we talk a little bit more about that and how the king prioritized the building of some of these temples?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a variety of things going on. Gods that are coming to the fore, areas, relocation, for instance, of the capital, which happened several times during the history of Egypt, areas that are considered quite resource rich that they want to cultivate favor for, why they might kind of plow in investment in those particular areas. But we really start to see the standardization that we think of as a typical Egyptian temple around the Middle Kingdom. And that's mostly because that's when we start to see things being built in stone. So prior to this, we're seeing lots of mud brick, which means actually it's probably hundreds of temples that existed that no longer exist, that we have no evidence for. So we maybe don't exactly know what the patterns were earlier on. But once we start to see stone temples, we're seeing a few key elements always coming in. Now, not every temple has every element, but obviously it depends on the size of the complex, how many kings are adding to it. We can have multiple versions of a single element. We'll come back to that with Karnak. But we tend to see an open court, open to the sky. That really obviously builds in a lot of the solar aspects of so many of these temples. And then we end up in a columned hall that's roofed over. A lot of the columns here resembling papyrus plants. This is kind of bringing us back to the creation myth, the early Egypt and all the beautiful lush landscapes of the papyrus thickets that we get along the delta. And then we go into kind of smaller and smaller rooms until we have a mound, if you like. So essentially a room that's slightly raised at the back. That's the sanctuary. And this again comes back to that story of creation. So a mound rose out of the waters of nothingness, and upon that mound, the first god appears and he creates the world. So we kind of keep that in the sense that when you look at a temple in a cross section, you get a very tall first few spaces, and then it gets lower, the ceiling, and also the floor gets higher, lower and higher and lower and higher. And then you've got quite a small space at the back. And this is not just a mimic of the world, but also a way of exclusion. So in the front courtyards, maybe this bit is open to the public at certain times during festivals, perhaps, or people can come for petitions. We know that people came to see justice served at the gates of temples, sometimes some sort of court that might have sat there. There's also sometimes a kind of early hospitals, if you like, people come and seek healing from priests who specialize in that, and they would maybe wait in these kind of more open areas. And then you get things more closed off. So you might get certain levels of priests that can access storerooms and courtyards and hypostyle halls, etc. But when you get back towards the sanctuary, you're only looking at the highest level of priests, the king himself, who can look upon the face of the god statue that exists in that sanctuary. So it's a physical metaphor for exclusion of more and more people towards the end into this smaller space with the god. And of course, the king's always able to go back there as the intermediary.
Of course. And you even said at the start, we touched upon it in our last episode as well, that today these temples are filled with hundreds, if not thousands of people, if you're lucky enough to go and visit.
Yeah.
And it's so different from what it would have been in antiquity. Yes. Very restricted.
Yeah.
Other than those few unique instances.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's what makes kind of festivals very unique, because this is something that might have existed earlier. We don't really have good written proof of how early some of these processional festivals, as we like to call them, existed. But we start to see it in the Middle Kingdom and then really heavily in the New Kingdom. And that's where the god is removed from his sanctuary. He's still in a shrine, so you still can't look upon his face, but he's carried on a model boat, essentially on the shoulders of priests, out into what is essentially a public space. So, between Karnak and Luxor, along the processional route there, or maybe around a temple on the outside of the enclosure wall. And this is maybe a time that people could kind of come up and get close to that statue, to the king if he's present. I said he couldn't be at every temple for every daily ritual, but he certainly can be at many places during these festivals that only happen maybe once a year. And that would be a really unique way for people to have that kind of interaction with the divine that occurs outside the physical restraints of the temple structure itself. There are other ways that people can interact with. We get what we call hearing ear chapels. So these are small, maybe 1 or 2 room chapels, essentially attached to the rear walls of temples. And this was a place where people could come and leave their offerings, leave their prayers. We get stela with lots of ears carved on them, with quite a literal plea of hear my prayer, if you like, or even modeled ears, which is great. And tons of other things left at these chapels. And the goal is for it to be transmitted. The Egyptologist Lanny Bell used a great thing. He called it a divinely appointed telephone booth. So essentially you're saying your prayer in this chapel that's outside the temple, and there's like some sort of magical cable that goes right into the sanctuary. And in fact, a lot of these chapels are in alignment with the sanctuary, but on the outside of the wall. So you get this great kind of direct line to the god, if you like, in that way.
Yeah, that's such a nice way of thinking about it. And even today, we have different ways of leaving thoughts or prayers in different circumstances linked to that specific thing you want to think about. So it's really nice to see the more human element of temples, I guess, to see the real people, how they were worshipping. And it wasn't the very formulated rituals and festivals we see.
Yeah. But I mean, bring it back to the king, of course, because that's kind of what we're trying to do. Is also the key with these hearing ear chapels is they're often built by a specific king to kind of serve the people. So the one attached to the back wall of Karnak is Thutmose III. And then there's a larger one built a bit further away from the wall, but kind of is still in alignment with the Thutmose chapel built by Ramses II. So these are kings that are recognizing that their people need this intermediary. So they're sponsoring that intermediary. So it's still always come back to the king, kind of paying attention to his flock in a way, if you like.
I was going to say, it's interesting to see that the king is still sponsoring, as you say, and doing these things. So it's putting himself beside the god and making sure they're possibly seen at the same level.
Oh, and 100%. The statue in the chapel of the hearing ear for Thutmose III is Amun and Thutmose III sat side by side, embracing. So this is my BFF, Amun, kind of thing going on with the king there. And he's front and center.
That's so interesting. And I love to bring it back to how real people would have been doing things in antiquity. It's so nice to see the similarities with what we do today.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, kings, when they add to temples, they don't always erase their predecessors' contributions. Sometimes a king will like to take credit by chiseling out his previous king and adding his own name over top. But what's really fascinating, especially for temples like Philae or Edfu, for instance, is you can see the multiple kings that are being added to it because they're appearing with their own names in different sections of the temple as it's being finished. And Karnak is a wonderful example of this. That temple complex grows over 1,000 years from the Middle Kingdom all the way through to the Roman period. And you see multiple kings performing very similar tasks because that stays highly consistent throughout the entire period, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting, this sort of like collective tradition built throughout decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very important, I think, when you're trying to win over a people, I suppose, but also rule over a very large and very valuable tract of land and people and products, etc. It's just a very clever way to maintain that continuity.
So interesting.
So we spoke a bit about kings overwriting their previous rulers' work. And this is a large, I don't want to say ego, But there might be an ego element to it. There might be a recycling element to it. In some situations, it's kind of a political posturing. I mean, we see with Thutmose III erasing Hatshepsut and putting his father's name on it or his name on it. This is kind of we think today, our thinking is more that it's to ensure the legitimacy of his succession line and not hers. But in some cases, it does seem to be a bit about ego, which is what I made that little dig about Ramses earlier, because he likes to whack his name on lots of stuff that wasn't his. So originally we said he was the most prolific builder of all of Egypt. Now that's pretty much still true, even stuff he made, but he likes to take credit for things other people did. But there's one bit where it's actually spawned a bit of a conspiracy theory. It involves Ramses II. In this case, it's not his ego, which is interestingly, he was doing it on behalf of his father. So his father, Seti I, he built a wonderful temple at Abydos. In fact, it might be one of the few temples where you can get an impression of what it was like in ancient Egypt, because the roof has been restored in some places and is original in others. So you get that real feeling of light and darkness and enclosure, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it is really beautiful. And there's a brilliant publication by Rosalie David that we have made re-available. It was out of print for a while, but you can now buy it again through the ES. So
yes, Religious Ritual at Abydos, fantastic book. The color images, oh my God, it's beautiful.
It is.
And also really great to tell you about the king's role in ritual in temples. So if you are more interested in that, would recommend this book. But what's fascinating is that Seti dies. This happens a lot. The king dies during some of his construction projects, obviously. They're very ambitious. They don't complete them all. And Ramses wants to finish the temple for his father. So Ramses, this isn't him trying to take it over. Ramses builds his own temple right next door. So it's not like he's trying to take it off of his father. He's just trying to be a good son and complete the architecture to make sure the temple is complete. In kind of the one hypostyle pillared hall, that's an in-between step. So the earliest halls are all Seti, the later ones are all Ramses, but there's one where they kind of share the work. Must have died in the middle. And Ramses essentially kind of fills in his father's cartouches and then carves his own over top. Now, what's happened is over time, the fill, which is usually just plaster, has popped out because, temperature changes, all sort of moisture, whatever. Now, this has resulted in a very interesting looking cartouche where the name of Ramses and the name of Seti are overlaid on top of each other and carved kind of in each other. And if you look with a very creative eye, one of them looks like a helicopter. And this has spawned a lot of theories about whether or not there was advanced technology in ancient Egypt. But if you have a bit of a search online, you can actually find where Egyptologists, have drawn the two cartouches in different colors, and you can see exactly how they overlap to form that shape that looks kind of like this helicopter. So unfortunately, sorry everyone, it's not nearly as exciting as everyone wants to make it. It is literally just Ramses trying to do his filial duty and finish up that temple for his dad.
Yes, as much as people, I think, would like to believe there's more modern technology earlier than we think. It's just how things were done and state of preservation now.
Absolutely. But the thing is, and I think, there's a little bit of a moment in this where we can really kind of flip the script, because people are saying, oh, they must have had advanced technology. They had incredible technology. I mean, look at the size of the columns in Karnak's temple. I mean, the thing is, a lot of us today are like, how in the world would you build that? And that's where, that's where this kind of idea of, oh, maybe they had help of some sort, advanced technology, something else. But it's not giving credit where credit is due. Yes. The Egyptians were so intelligent.
Yeah, it's a disservice to them.
Absolutely. And the architects and the builders and the astronomers who looked at the alignment of the stars and studied them to make sure they're getting things exactly north, south, or east, west, or whatever. I mean, the columns in Karnak, for instance, we know that they were essentially built, and then kind of a sand ramp is built up around them as they get higher and higher and higher. And then when you get to the top, it's reversed. So now the builders go away, the artisans come in, and they start to carve top to bottom. And as the sand comes down, they're carving the decoration in from top to bottom, which is just fascinating and really, really interesting. And of course, there is, ancient scaffolding as well and all that. So I think, as fun as it is to sometimes lean into these conspiracy theories, you're actually almost disadvantaging the real genius of the ancient Egyptians, and learning about how they did it blows your mind even further, I think.
Oh, yeah. And especially if you're lucky enough to go to Egypt, and obviously would highly recommend a visit.
Indeed.
To go to some of these temples, just standing in them, the awe you feel when you look up, and always look up, because often if there is a roof still preserved, it is the most beautiful part because it often has more pigment there. But yeah, it's incredible just imagining the amount of work and thought and process that went into that in ancient times.
And, this really, again, comes back to the king because, as we know, you see in the intermediate period, you don't see as much monumental building. The art styles are a bit less standardized. So it really is kind of through royal patronage that we get this production.
Quite incredible.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing that misconception to light and breaking it.
Yes. Sorry, everyone. But
No, it's good. It's good to question these things and really think, actually, what is the real meaning behind these things? So thank you for that.
No problem.
So we mentioned festivals. I think it'd be great to think about more the rituals then inside the temple.
Yes.
As we say, not necessarily for the main population, but what were those rituals looking like, and were they also sponsored by the king?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of the materials being used in them are directly coming from the king. So we have a great festival calendar on the outside of Medinet Habu temple, and it talks about how the offerings, so the foodstuffs or the linen, are all coming out of the king's coffers, out of his estates. Now, later on, temples own lots and lots of land. Karnak was a massive landholder, and that actually almost enabled Karnak to rival the king's power. And in fact, in the 21st dynasty, we see high priests of Karnak calling themselves pharaoh in the south. And that's because of the resources that they have. So yes, the king is definitely sponsoring some of these things.
Yeah, that's a very interesting time period in Egypt where it's divided once again, as it was in much earlier times between the king in the north and the high priests in the south.
Yeah, the power that's wielded by temples is unbelievable in these later periods. But I think the key thing about temple rituals, the very first requirement is purity. So this is one of the big reasons why you couldn't just let anybody in the temple. You had to purify yourself. Priests, they didn't serve all year round. Some did, especially in later periods, were kind of full-time priests, if you like. But most people were serving 1 month out of every 4 months. So they're serving in a kind of rotation, if you like. And they were officials or other things in their normal daily life, but they had to, shave their hair. They had to bathe properly, eat only certain foods, abstain from sex, all sorts of things while they were serving. And the king would have had to undergo certain purification rituals as well if he's coming into the temple or if he's doing any of the normal daily rituals side by side with the priests. And in fact, we know in several temples, coronation rituals were performed there. We have little coronation kind of booths, kiosks, if you like. There's one in Karnak where the king would have been performing some of these rituals. And of course, the Sed festival, which is the king's jubilee, if you like, that happens in the kind of complex at the Djoser pyramid nearby the temple there. But once you get past all the purification, you get inside, there's a bunch of various things that need to happen. Now, I mentioned that a temple is the literal house of God. It's his personal or her personal residence. And that means that they're there. And they are, in fact, in the sanctuary. There's a statue. Should be said that the Egyptians didn't believe that the statue was divine, but was rather a container that the divine kind of ka or spirit could inhabit. But it needed to be taken good care of. So you have your kind of morning ritual, your evening ritual, where you are literally opening up the doors, letting the light in, saying good morning to the statue, undressing it, bathing it, giving it food and drink, redressing it in new clothing, and then doing various things over the day, giving hymns and prayer. And then at night, you're saying good night and shutting it up. And that's a very important part of the workings of a temple on a daily basis. And then you have the kind of larger festival rituals, which happen more rarely. So often once a year. In Luxor, you get two big ones, the Beautiful Festival of the Valley, which is a more funerary-based one, and then the Obit Festival, which is more about kind of renewal of the king's power itself. And those are the processional ones that I mentioned earlier, where the statue's taken out, not necessarily specifically to go amongst the people. In this case, it does go amongst the people, obviously, on its route, but it's visiting. So the statue's visiting Luxor Temple from Karnak, or Deir al-Bahri from Karnak. And that's kind of the goal, is to travel along with that statue there and participate in all the rituals. And we're talking about things like offering incense, offering wine and milk and meat. So there's a huge industry that pops up around this. You have to be able to have all the things in the storehouses. Where are the animals being butchered? Where are the amulets being made? All these things. And this is how temples start to accumulate power, because like we can see at huge temple complexes at Karnak, they start doing this on site. And so they're actually having stables of sacred animals and crafts people working on site. And that generates a huge investment, obviously, and a huge amount of not cash, because we don't have cash in ancient Egypt, but we're having power through economics. So a temple is not just about worship, but also an economic powerhouse. And that's how the Amun priests gained so much power that they could challenge the pharaoh in the 21st dynasty, which is quite impressive.
Yes. Some of you might have gathered why we didn't say kings in our title, but elevating earthly rulers, because yes, it elevated some of the priests as well as the king.
Absolutely. And, the high priest, he's not serving on a rotation. He's full-time at this point in time, especially as we get to the 21st dynasty. And the amount of power he has through not just economics, but also knowledge. So temple complexes also had precincts. These are like library archive schools all blended up into one, house of life. And we know from some library spaces in temples like Edfu, which have on the walls carved the names of the quote unquote books that were kept in these libraries, that there's vast amount of knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, geography, magic, all sorts of things that was at the hands of certain levels of priests. So yeah, you've got a huge amount of power going on there. And it's not just about the physical structure of the building, but what's going on and who's involved inside.
Yeah, they were real economic powerhouses,
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. And they served as a way to kind of keep Egypt's cultural ideas all in one place, if you like, because we're talking about, kingship being a huge part of this, but also religion, also economy, also crafts production. In one place, you've kind of distilled down a lot of the ideas of ancient Egypt, which is fascinating.
Yeah, so I think to try and answer our question of the day, were Egyptian temples built to honor the heavens or elevate earthly rulers? I think it's both.
Oh, absolutely.
And so much more.
Yeah, and it's, we might be able to say that in the earliest days, it was separate and it's local people calling on local gods and the king's not really involved. But once we start to get into the heart of the old kingdom and we start to see the standardization, it is absolutely completely intertwined. But so then is the divine and kingship. There's just no way of plucking that apart in ancient Egypt. So yes, both. The answer is 100% both.
Yeah. I love to see such blurred boundaries between these things. And it's come out throughout the season of the podcast that, the king and the gods are totally intertwined, which is quite an interesting concept, I think, for a modern audience as well.
Yeah, but I mean, this all, of course, comes back to the idea of defining religion. That's where we struggle, I think. If we were to go back in time and say, like, how religious were you? An ancient Egyptian would be like, I mean, what do you mean religious? The gods are everywhere. They're in the water and like they just exist. I don't need to call on them. They just are. And that's not necessarily how people view it. I know some people do. I'm not saying that that's not a modern belief at all. But I still think in modern lives, there's like our personal religious selves that we don't bring to work with us necessarily, unless maybe you are a priest. But then there's, kind of the secular world. And that line didn't exist in Egypt as far as we can kind of understand it. And we'll never really be able to understand it because it's cultural and we weren't raised in that culture. So we're trying our best.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. Thank you so much, Kelly, for going through all of that with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for listening.